In the shadows of the early 20th century, a malevolent force took root in the heart of Europe, its tendrils reaching into the very foundations of power and wealth. This was the Nazi Party, born from the ashes of World War I in 1920, and its rise to infamy was fueled by a dark and sinister secret: the complicity of some of Germany's most powerful industrialists and financiers. Picture this: a dimly lit room in 1933, where a clandestine meeting between Adolf Hitler and a group of influential businessmen, including Gustav Krupp and Fritz Thyssen, took place. This unholy alliance, known as the Secret Meeting of the 20th of February 1933, sealed the fate of Germany and the world. The price? A mere 3 million Reichsmarks, a sum that would pale in comparison to the profits these industrialists would reap from the Nazi war machine. As the Nazi Party tightened its grip on power, companies like IG Farben, Krupp and Siemens flourished, their fortunes built on the backs of slave labor and the plunder of occupied territories. The chemical giant IG Farben, for example, was deeply involved in the production of Zyklon B, the lethal gas used in the extermination camps, while Krupp manufactured the weapons that fueled Hitler's blitzkrieg across Europe. The numbers are staggering. By 1945, it is estimated that over 500,000 concentration camp inmates were used as slave labor by German companies. As the Austrian writer and Holocaust victim Fritz Beder revealed, "Gold teeth, it is from the Jews, from the concentration camps." This harrowing insight unveils the gruesome reality of how the Nazis profited from the suffering and death of their victims. Join us as we delve into the murky depths of Nazi wealth, tracing its origins from the smoke-filled rooms to the war-torn ruins of 1945. Welcome to the Diary of Julius Caesar. The coffers of hatred, unraveling the financial roots of the Nazi Party. In the tumultuous years following World War I, a dark shadow began to spread across Germany. The Nazi Party, led by the charismatic and ruthless Adolf Hitler, emerged from the depths of political obscurity, its tendrils reaching into every corner of German society. But how did this once fringe movement amass the financial resources necessary to propel itself to the forefront of national politics? The answer lies in a complex web of contributions from German industrialists, party membership fees, and the exploitation of a nation's deepest fears and prejudices. Like a malevolent phoenix rising from the ashes of Germany's defeat, the Nazi Party sought to capitalize on the economic turmoil that gripped the nation in the early 1920s. With hyperinflation ravaging the country and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles still fresh in the minds of the populace, Hitler and his followers saw an opportunity to seize power. In 1923, at the height of the hyperinflation crisis, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks, rendering the German currency practically worthless. Hitler, in his infamous book Mein Kampf, would later write, "The misery of our people is horrible to behold. Millions of the industrial proletariat are unemployed and starving. The whole of the middle class and the small artisans have been impoverished." However, to achieve their nefarious goals, they needed more than just rhetoric and propaganda. They needed cold, hard cash. Enter the German industrialists, the puppet masters of the nation's economy. These wealthy and influential figures, many of whom had profited handsomely from the First World War, saw in Hitler a potential ally in their quest to maintain their privileged status. One such industrialist was Emil Kurdorf, a coal magnate who was among the first to recognize the potential of the Nazi Party. In 1927, Kurdorf attended a meeting at the home of Hermann Göring, where Hitler delivered an impassioned speech outlining his vision for Germany's future. Kurdorf was so impressed that he immediately donated 100,000 Reichsmarks to the party, a staggering sum equivalent to over $500,000 in today's currency. Another notable industrialist was Fritz Thyssen, the head of the Vereinigte Stahlwerke, United Steelworks, who contributed over 1 million Reichsmarks to the Nazi Party between 1923 and 1933. In his book, I Paid Hitler, Thyssen would later write, "I am not a politician, but I can no longer remain silent. I must speak out and declare that I am a German and a National Socialist. Kehrdorff's generosity was not an isolated incident. Other industrialists, such as Friedrich Flick and Gustav Krupp, soon followed suit, pouring millions of Reichsmarks into the Nazi Party's coffers. These men, who controlled vast swaths of Germany's industrial might, saw in Hitler a charismatic leader who could protect their interests and keep the rising tide of communism at bay. In a twisted irony, the very capitalists who would later be vilified by the Nazi regime were among its earliest and most ardent supporters. The relationship between the industrialists and the Nazi Party was personified by the infamous Himmler Circle, a group of wealthy businessmen who regularly met with SS leader Heinrich Himmler to discuss economic policy and provide financial support for the party's activities. One member of the circle, Wilhelm Kepler, would later boast, "Industry must be organized according to the Führer principle." But the industrialists were not the only source of funding for the Nazi Party. Hitler, ever the master manipulator, recognized the power of grassroots support. He instituted a system of party membership fees, requiring each member to pay a monthly sum to support the cause. These fees, though small individually, added up to a significant amount when multiplied by the party's rapidly growing membership. By 1928, the Nazi Party boasted over 100,000 members, each contributing to the financial lifeblood of the movement. The party also relied heavily on the sale of propaganda materials, such as posters, pamphlets, and books, to generate revenue. The infamous Sturmabteilung, or SA, the party's paramilitary wing, even sold a brand of cigarettes called Sturm, with a portion of the profits going directly to the party's coffers. As the Nazi Party's wealth grew, so too did its influence. The party poured its resources into propaganda, flooding the streets with posters, pamphlets, and newspapers that spread its message of hate and division. They organized rallies and marches, drawing ever larger crowds with each passing month. In 1929, the party even purchased a newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, which became the official mouthpiece of the Nazi movement. The paper's circulation grew rapidly, from just 8,000 copies per day in 1923 to over 120,000 by 1931. Joseph Goebbels, the party's chief propagandist, would later write in his diary, "Propaganda is a truly terrible weapon in the hands of an expert." The Nazi Party's financial success was not without its controversies. In 1924, the party was banned in Bavaria, its stronghold, after Hitler's failed beer hall putsch. The ban forced the party to operate in secret, relying on clandestine meetings and shadowy benefactors to keep its coffers full. It was during this time that Ernst Röhm, a former army officer and close associate of Hitler, helped to establish the Sturmabteilung, or SA, the party's paramilitary wing. The SA served as a physical manifestation of the Nazi Party's growing power, intimidating opponents and protecting party leaders from harm. In 1927, during a rally in Nuremberg, Hitler declared, "We are not a charitable institution, but a party of revolutionary socialists who have to be taken seriously." As the 1920s drew to a close, the Nazi Party's financial empire had grown to staggering proportions. By 1928, the party's annual income had reached 1.5 million Reichsmarks, a testament to the effectiveness of its fundraising efforts. This war chest would prove invaluable in the years to come, as the party sought to seize power through a combination of electoral success and brute force. In the 1930 elections, the Nazi Party became the second largest party in the Reichstag, with over 18% of the vote. Hitler, in a speech delivered in Munich on January 30th, 1933, declared, "Give us 4 years, and you will not recognize Germany anymore." The plunder of Europa, the Nazi looting of art and cultural treasures. As the shadows of the Third Reich stretched across Europe, a lesser-known but equally sinister aspect of Nazi oppression began to unfold. Like a voracious beast, the Nazi regime embarked on a systematic campaign of looting, pillaging the art and cultural treasures of occupied countries with ruthless efficiency. From the grandest museums to the humblest private collections, no object of beauty or significance was safe from their rapacious grasp. Hitler himself, a failed artist, had grandiose visions of creating a massive art complex in his hometown of Linz, Austria, filled with the spoils of his conquests. In a chilling statement, Hitler declared, "The great masters are not to be found in the galleries of the plutocrats, but in the cellars and storerooms." The scale of the Nazi art plunder was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 1933 and 1945, the regime seized over 600,000 works of art from across Europe, a haul that would be worth billions of dollars today. The looting was not merely a byproduct of war, but a carefully orchestrated operation, overseen by some of the highest-ranking members of the Nazi elite. In France alone, the Nazis confiscated around 100,000 art objects, including 21,000 paintings and 583 sculptures from the famed Louvre Museum in Paris. The Nazis even had a special unit, the Kunstschutz, dedicated to the protection of cultural property, a euphemism for organized theft. At the center of this web of cultural theft was the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, a special task force created by Adolf Hitler in 1940 and headed by the notorious ideologue Alfred Rosenberg. The ERR was tasked with confiscating cultural property from Jewish collectors and other enemies of the state in occupied territories, particularly France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. One of the ERR's most infamous operations was the looting of the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris, which the Nazis turned into a clearinghouse for stolen Jewish art. Between 1940 and 1944, the ERR processed over 22,000 objects through the museum, meticulously cataloguing each piece before shipping it off to Germany. The modus operandi of the ERR was as efficient as it was brutal. They would descend upon a targeted collection, often with little warning, and meticulously catalogue every item before packing it up and shipping it back to Germany. The owners, many of whom were Jewish, were left with nothing, their cherished possessions ripped away as they themselves were herded off to concentration camps. The experience of Paul Rosenberg, one of the most prominent Jewish art dealers in Paris, was typical. In 1940, the ERR confiscated over 400 works from Rosenberg's gallery, including masterpieces by Picasso, Matisse, and Braque. Rosenberg, who had fled to the United States, would spend the rest of his life trying to recover his lost collection. One of the most infamous examples of the ERR's handiwork was the looting of the Rothschild family collection in France. In 1940, the Nazis seized over 5,000 pieces from the renowned Jewish banking dynasty, including rare books, manuscripts, and works by masters such as Rembrandt and Vermeer. The collection was so vast that it filled several train cars, which were promptly shipped back to Germany. The Rothschilds, like so many other Jewish families, were left destitute, their cultural heritage stripped away along with their wealth. In the words of James de Rothschild, "They have taken my home, my books, my paintings, everything I possessed, but they cannot take my soul or my dignity." But the ER was not the only Nazi organization involved in the art plunder. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's most trusted lieutenants, was also an avid collector, using his position to amass a vast trove of stolen art. Göring's collection, which numbered over 1,800 pieces at its peak, was housed in his sprawling country estate, Karinhall, named after his first wife. Göring's taste was eclectic, ranging from old master paintings to modern works, but he had a particular fondness for Renaissance and Baroque art. Among his most prized possessions was the Portrait of a Young Man by Raphael, which he acquired through dubious means from the Czartoryski Museum in Krakow, Poland. Göring's appetite for art was insatiable, and he stopped at nothing to satisfy it. In one notorious incident, he pressured the Vichy French government to sell him the priceless Ghent altarpiece, a 15th-century masterpiece by Jan van Eyck, for a fraction of its true value. The painting, which had been looted from Belgium, was eventually recovered by the Allies and returned to its rightful owners. Göring's rapacity knew no bounds. As evidenced by his chilling statement, "It used to be called plunder. But today, things have become more humane. In spite of that, I intend to plunder and to do it thoroughly. As the war turned against Germany, the Nazis became increasingly desperate to hide their stolen treasures. Many works were shuttled to secret locations across the Reich, stashed away in salt mines, castles, and underground bunkers. In the final days of the war, as Allied troops closed in on Berlin, a frantic effort was made to destroy records of the looted art in a vain attempt to cover up the regime's crimes. The Merkers mine in central Germany became a notorious repository for Nazi loot, housing everything from gold bullion to priceless paintings. When American troops discovered the mine in April 1945, they found a staggering 40,000 gold bars, 2,700 bags of gold coins, and hundreds of crates of art objects. But the Allies were not to be deterred. As they liberated occupied territories, they established special units tasked with tracking down and recovering the stolen art. The most famous of these was the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program, better known as the Monuments Men, a group of art historians, curators, and other experts who scoured Europe for missing treasures. The Monuments Men, immortalized in the 2014 film of the same name, included luminaries such as James Rohrimer, the future director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Rose Valland, a French art historian who secretly recorded the movements of looted art during the Nazi occupation. The Monuments Men faced a daunting task. Many works had been hidden or destroyed, and the sheer scale of the looting made it difficult to track down every missing piece. But their efforts were not in vain. Over the course of several years, they recovered thousands of stolen works, from priceless paintings to ancient artifacts. In one of their most celebrated feats, the Monuments Men rescued the Bruges Madonna, a Michelangelo sculpture that had been looted from Belgium, from a salt mine in Austria. As Monuments man Walker Hancock put it, "We were in a race against destruction. The Germans were determined to destroy everything as they fled, and we were determined to stop them." One of the most remarkable recoveries was the discovery of the Altaussee salt mine in Austria, where the Nazis had stashed over 6,500 paintings and sculptures, including works by Michelangelo, Vermeer, and Rembrandt. The mine, which was rigged with explosives, was saved from destruction by the timely arrival of Allied troops in May 1945. Among the treasures found in the mine was the famed Ghent altarpiece, which had been looted by Göring years earlier. The recovery of the altarpiece was a moment of triumph for the Monuments Men, a validation of their tireless efforts to preserve the cultural heritage of Europe. In recent years, renewed efforts have been made to identify and return looted art, with some notable successes. In 2012, for example, the German government returned a painting by Henri Matisse to the descendants of Paul Rosenberg, more than 70 years after it was stolen by the Nazis. The glittering spoils of war, how the Nazis amassed gold, and the Swiss connection. As the Third Reich's shadow loomed over Europe, an insidious financial plot unfolded behind the scenes. The Nazis, driven by their insatiable hunger for power and wealth, embarked on a relentless quest to amass vast quantities of gold. Like a swarm of locusts descending upon a field, they stripped occupied nations of their precious reserves, leaving a trail of economic devastation in their wake. As the German writer Gustav Freytag once observed, "Gold is the god of our time, and Rothschild is his prophet." The Nazis' lust for gold knew no bounds. They targeted the central banks of conquered countries, looting their reserves with ruthless efficiency. In 1938, shortly after the annexation of Austria, the Nazis seized 78 million Reichsmarks worth of gold from the Austrian National Bank. This was just the beginning of their plunder. As the war progressed and the Reich's tentacles spread across Europe, the scale of the looting intensified. In 1940, after the fall of France, the Nazis confiscated over 2,500 tons of gold from the French Central Bank, worth approximately $300 million at the time. The gold was loaded onto a special train, the Gold Train, and shipped off to Germany, never to be seen again. One of the most notorious incidents of Nazi gold confiscation occurred in Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, after the German occupation of Prague, the Nazis demanded that the Czechoslovak National Bank surrender its entire gold reserve, amounting to 94,772 kilograms. The bank's governor, Josef Malik, protested vehemently, but to no avail. The gold, worth approximately $125 million at the time, was promptly shipped off to Germany, never to be seen again. The Czechoslovak government in exile, led by President Edvard Beneš, would later describe the looting as the greatest robbery in history. The Nazis' insatiable appetite for gold extended beyond the vaults of central banks. They also targeted Jewish individuals and businesses, confiscating their assets as part of the regime's grotesque campaign of persecution. The Nazis established the Reichsbank, the central bank of Germany, as a repository for looted gold, including gold teeth and wedding rings stripped from concentration camp victims. The sheer scale of this morbid hoard is staggering. Estimates suggest that the Nazis amassed over 8.5 million ounces of gold, worth billions of dollars in today's currency. In a chilling statement, Reichsbank President Walter Funk declared, "The Reichsbank has always considered it a special duty to facilitate the utilization of the stolen property of the Jews." But the Nazis' plundered gold would have been of little use without a way to convert it into foreign currency. Enter the Swiss banking system, a neutral financial haven that became a crucial cog in the Nazi war machine. Switzerland, with its long-standing tradition of banking secrecy, proved to be an ideal conduit for the Nazis to launder their ill-gotten gains. The Swiss banks, lured by the prospect of profits and the promise of secrecy, readily accepted Nazi gold, turning a blind eye to its origins. The Reichsbank, acting as an intermediary, sold the looted gold to Swiss banks, which in turn used it to finance the Nazis' war effort. The banks converted the gold into Swiss francs, which were then used to purchase raw materials, weapons, and other essential supplies. One of the most prominent Swiss banks involved in these transactions was the Swiss National Bank, SNB. Between 1939 and 1945, the SNB purchased a staggering 1.2 billion Swiss francs worth of Nazi gold, equivalent to $280 million at the time. The bank's leadership, including its president Ernst Weber, justified their actions by claiming that they were simply maintaining Switzerland's neutrality. In reality, they were profiting from the suffering of millions. As the historian Jean Ziegler noted, the Swiss banks were the principal financial agents of the Nazi regime, and their top executives were fully aware of the criminal origin of the gold they were receiving. The extent of the Swiss banks' complicity in the Nazi gold trade was not fully revealed until decades after the war. In 1996, a group of Jewish organizations and Holocaust survivors filed a class-action lawsuit against the Swiss banks, accusing them of hoarding the assets of Nazi victims and profiting from the Holocaust. The lawsuit, known as the Swiss Gold Case, sparked an international scandal and led to a $1.25 billion settlement by the Swiss banks. The settlement, reached in 1998, was the largest of its kind in history and marked a significant milestone in the quest for justice for Holocaust survivors and their families. The legacy of Nazi gold and the Swiss connection continues to haunt the world to this day. In the late 1990s, a series of international conferences were held to address the issue of Nazi-looted assets, including gold. The Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets, held in 1998, established the Washington Principles, a set of guidelines for identifying and returning looted art and other cultural property. The Tripartite Gold Commission, established in 1946 to oversee the distribution of recovered Nazi gold, continued its work well into the 21st century. In 2001, the Commission oversaw the return of $60 million worth of gold to the central banks of 10 European countries, including Albania, Austria, and Belgium. Despite these efforts, much of the Nazi gold remains unaccounted for. Some of it was undoubtedly lost or destroyed in the chaotic final days of the war, while other caches may still be hidden away in secret vaults or private collections. The search for this lost treasure has taken on a mythical quality, inspiring countless books, films, and conspiracy theories. In 1997, for example, a group of treasure hunters claimed to have discovered a cache of Nazi gold in the Swiss Alps, sparking a media frenzy and a frantic search by the Swiss authorities. The claim turned out to be a hoax, but it underscored the enduring fascination with the legend of Nazi gold. The chains of bondage, the Nazi exploitation of forced labor, and the darkness of the human soul. In the shadows of the Third Reich, a heinous system of oppression and exploitation was born. The Nazi regime, driven by its twisted ideology and insatiable hunger for power, turned to forced labor as a means to fuel its war machine and line the pockets of German industrialists. Like a monstrous beast devouring the innocent, the Nazi forced labor program consumed millions of lives, leaving behind a legacy of shattered dreams and unimaginable suffering. As the poet Paul Celan, himself a survivor of the Nazi labor camps, wrote, "Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening. We drink it at midday and morning, we drink it at night. We drink and we drink." The conditions endured by the forced laborers were nothing short of horrific. They were subjected to long hours, meager rations, and brutal treatment at the hands of their German overseers. In the factories and mines of the Reich, they toiled in darkness and squalor, their bodies pushed to the brink of exhaustion, and their spirits crushed under the weight of despair. At the Krupp factory in Essen, for example, forced laborers worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in conditions that were described as hell on earth. The workers, many of whom were children as young as 12, were beaten, starved, and worked to death in the service of the German war effort. One survivor, a Polish woman named Janina Nowak, recalled, "We worked in the laundry from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. If one of the SS men saw that a woman was tired, he would beat her. Many of us had scars and open wounds from the beatings we received while working." The economic impact of the Nazi forced labor program was staggering. By 1944, more than 20% of the German workforce was composed of forced laborers, and they played a crucial role in keeping the Nazi war machine running. In the armaments industry alone, forced laborers accounted for a third of all workers, producing everything from bullets and bombs to tanks and aircraft. The German company IG Farben, for example, relied heavily on forced labor to produce synthetic rubber and oil, essential components of the Nazi war effort. At its peak, the company employed more than 83,000 forced laborers, many of whom were worked to death in the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp. The company's profits soared during the war years, with its annual revenue reaching 3 billion Reichsmarks by 1944. As the historian Peter Hayes noted, IG Farben's involvement in the Nazi regime was not a matter of necessity, but of choice. The company's leaders saw in Hitler's regime an opportunity to expand their wealth and power, and they eagerly seized it. The human cost of the Nazi forced labor program was incalculable. Millions of workers were subjected to unimaginable cruelty and suffering, their lives forever shattered by the brutality of the Nazi regime. At the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, for example, forced laborers were used to construct the V-2 rocket, a weapon of mass destruction that would rain terror on the cities of London and Antwerp. The workers, many of whom were prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, were forced to toil in underground tunnels, carving out a vast network of caves and chambers in the heart of the Harz Mountains. The conditions in the tunnels were appalling, with workers subjected to extreme temperatures, toxic fumes, and the constant threat of cave-ins and explosions. More than 20,000 workers died at Mittelbau-Dora, their bodies broken and their spirits crushed by the weight of Nazi oppression. As one survivor, a French resistance fighter named Guy Moron, recalled, "The work was so hard and the conditions so terrible that the only way to survive was to shut off your mind and become a machine. You had to forget about your family, your friends, your past life. You had to forget that you were human." Yet even in the darkest depths of despair, there were glimmers of hope and resistance. The forced laborers, despite the unimaginable odds stacked against them, found ways to resist their oppressors, and maintain their humanity. At the Buchenwald concentration camp, for example, a group of Jewish prisoners formed a secret resistance organization, smuggling food and medicine to their fellow inmates and sabotaging German war production. Their bravery and sacrifice, in the face of unimaginable adversity, stand as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of hope in the face of darkness. As one of the leaders of the Buchenwald resistance, a Polish Jew named Eugen Kogon later wrote, "The concentration camp was the most terrible of all hells. But even in this inferno, the will to resist could not be extinguished. The prisoners fought not only to survive, but to triumph over the system that sought to destroy them." The plundered legacy, the Aryanization of Jewish property, and the echoes of stolen lives. In the darkened alleys of Nazi Germany, a sinister process was unfolding, a systematic theft of Jewish lives and livelihoods that would come to be known as Aryanization. Like a malevolent force creeping through the shadows, the Nazis' campaign to seize Jewish property and businesses spread like a cancer, consuming everything in its path. As the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber once said, "The world is not comprehensible, but it is embraceable through the embracing of one of its beings." The process of Aryanization began in the early days of the Nazi regime, as a trickle that would soon become a flood. In April 1933, just months after Hitler's rise to power, the Nazis enacted the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which banned Jews from holding government jobs and paved the way for their exclusion from other professions. This was followed by a series of decrees and laws that steadily tightened the noose around Germany's Jewish population, stripping them of their rights and their property. On November 12, 1938, in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, the Nazis imposed a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community, ostensibly as punishment for the assassination of a German diplomat by a Jewish teenager in Paris. In reality, it was a pretext for the wholesale plunder of Jewish wealth. As the writer and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi would later observe, "We had reached the bottom, deprived of every right, exposed to every insult, condemned to certain death. The only thing that remained to us was our bare lives, stripped of every dignity and every hope." One of the most notorious examples of Aryanization was the case of the Kaufhaus des Westens, or KaDeWe, a sprawling department store in the heart of Berlin. Founded by a Jewish entrepreneur named Adolf Hitler in 1907, the KaDeWe was a symbol of the city's vibrant commercial culture, a palace of consumption that drew shoppers from across Europe. But with the rise of the Nazis, Jandorf and his family were forced to flee Germany, leaving their beloved store behind. In 1933, the KaDeWe was Aryanized, its ownership transferred to a group of Nazi party members who paid a fraction of its true value. The store would go on to become a favorite haunt of the Nazi elite, a glittering showcase for the regime's propaganda and a symbol of its power. The story of the KaDeWe is just one example of the thousands of Jewish businesses that were stolen during this time. In 1938, the Nazis forced the sale of the Frankfurter Zeitung, one of Germany's most respected newspapers, to the Nazi-owned publishing house Eher Verlag for a mere 100,000 Reichsmarks, a fraction of its true value. The KaDeWe was just one of countless Jewish businesses and properties that fell victim to Aryanization. Across Germany, Jewish-owned shops, factories and homes were seized by the state or sold off at fire sale prices to Aryan buyers. In many cases, the owners were given no choice but to sell, their businesses and properties effectively stolen from them. Those who refused to comply faced arrest, imprisonment, and even deportation to concentration camps. The Mendelssohn Bank, one of the oldest and most respected Jewish-owned banks in Germany, was Aryanized in 1938, its assets stripped and its owners forced to flee the country. As one Jewish businessman, Hugo Hahn, later recalled, "I was given an ultimatum: either sell my business within 24 hours or face arrest. I had no choice but to comply." The story of Hahn's forced sale is just one of many similar accounts from this dark period in history. The economic impact of Aryanization was staggering. By 1938, it is estimated that more than 2/3 of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany had been liquidated or transferred to Aryan ownership. The total value of the assets seized is difficult to calculate, but some estimates put it as high as 12 billion Reichsmarks, equivalent to more than $6 billion in today's currency. In Austria, which was annexed by Germany in March 1938, the Aryanization of Jewish property was even more extensive. Within just a few months, more than 80% of Jewish-owned businesses had been seized or sold off, with the proceeds flowing into the coffers of the Nazi state. The money flowed into the coffers of the Nazi state and the pockets of Nazi Party members and supporters, fueling the regime's war machine and its campaign of conquest and genocide. As the historian Gozali has written, Aryanization was not just a crime against the Jews, it was a crime against humanity, a theft on a scale that had never been seen before. The human cost of Aryanization was incalculable. For Germany's Jewish population, it was a process of systematic impoverishment and dispossession, a stripping away of their wealth, their livelihoods, and their dignity. Many were left destitute, forced to rely on the kindness of friends and relatives, or to flee the country altogether. The story of the Ladenburger family is a poignant example of the human toll of Aryanization. Owners of a successful clothing store in the city of Mannheim, the Ladenburgers were forced to sell their business in 1938 for a fraction of its value. With no means of support, they were forced to flee to France, where they lived in poverty and obscurity until the end of the war. Others took their own lives, unable to bear the shame and despair of losing everything they had worked so hard to build. In 1941, the Jewish writer Stefan Zweig, who had fled Austria after the Anschluss, took his own life in Brazil, writing in his note, "I think it better to conclude in good time and in erect bearing a life in which intellectual labor meant the purest joy and personal freedom, the highest good on earth." The iron fist of progress, the Nazi economic miracle, and the shadows of war. In the early 1930s, Germany was a nation on the brink of collapse, its economy shattered by the ravages of the Great Depression and its people haunted by the specter of poverty and despair. At the heart of Hitler's plan was a massive program of economic revival and militarization, a campaign to rebuild Germany's shattered infrastructure and rearm its military for the battles to come. In the words of the historian Alan Bullock, Hitler's dictatorship rested on the constitutional foundation of a single law, the enabling law, passed by a docile Reichstag on the 23rd of March 1933. This law gave the government the power to enact decrees independently of the Reichstag and the presidency. The Nazi rise to power in 1933 marked a turning point in German history, a moment when the country began its long march toward war and conquest. Hitler's first priority was to revive the German economy, which had been devastated by years of hyperinflation, unemployment, and political instability. To achieve this, he embarked on a massive program of public works and rearmament, pouring billions of Reichsmarks into the construction of new roads, bridges, and factories. The Autobahn, a network of high-speed highways that crisscrossed the country, became a symbol of Nazi progress and modernity, a gleaming ribbon of concrete that stretched from the Baltic to the Alps. By 1936, more than 100,000 workers were employed in the construction of the Autobahn, a figure that would rise to over 400,000 by the outbreak of World War II. As Hitler himself declared in a speech in 1933, "Our task is to provide work and bread for our people. The methods by which we do this are of secondary importance." The Reichsarbeitsdienst, RAD, a compulsory work service program established in 1935, put hundreds of thousands of young Germans to work on public works projects, including land reclamation, forestry, and agricultural development. By 1939, over 1.6 million Germans had served in the RAD. But the Autobahn was just the beginning of Hitler's economic revolution. To fuel the Nazi war machine, Hitler poured vast sums of money into the rearmament of the German military, a process that would transform the country into a bristling fortress of steel and fire. The Wagner-Papen-Papier War Development Plan, 1933 to 1934, was decreed by Hitler in August 1933, explicitly prioritizing military armament over the civilian economy and public needs. During 1933 to 1939, according to historian Richard Overy, German military expenditures reached 51.8 billion Reichsmarks, about 23% of Germany's entire GDP. Under the direction of Hitler's architect Albert Speer, factories sprouted up across the country, churning out tanks, planes, and guns at an astonishing rate. By 1939, Germany had the largest military in Europe, with over 4 million men under arms and a fleet of more than 2,500 aircraft. At companies like Krupp and IG Farben, the profits flowed like rivers of gold as the Nazi war machine consumed everything in its path. In the words of Krupp chief Gustav Krupp, "The day has arrived. We must be ready, and we are ready to our last bullet, to our last breath." IG Farben, a massive chemical conglomerate, played a central role in the Nazi war effort, producing synthetic oil, rubber, and explosives. The company also infamously supplied the Zyklon B gas used in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and other concentration camps. The human cost of Hitler's economic miracle was incalculable. Millions of Germans were put to work in the factories and fields, their labor fueling the Nazi war machine. But for those who did not fit into Hitler's vision of a pure Aryan race, the consequences were brutal. Jews, Romani people, homosexuals, and political dissidents were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, where they were worked to death in the service of the Nazi state. At the Dachau concentration camp, established in 1933, prisoners were forced to work in a variety of SS-owned businesses, including a porcelain factory and an herb plantation. The products they made were sold to fund the Nazi Party and SS activities. Hundreds of thousands more were forcibly sterilized or murdered in the name of racial purity. As Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess declared in a speech in 1934, National Socialism is nothing but applied biology. The slave labor program reached its peak in 1944, when over 7 million foreign workers, POWs, and concentration camp inmates were forced to work in the German war economy. As Albert Speer later admitted during the Nuremberg trials, the treatment of these slaves was excessively cruel, and the death rate was extraordinarily high. The Nazi economic miracle was a Faustian bargain, a pact with the devil that would lead Germany down a path of destruction and ruin. By 1939, the country was on the brink of war, its economy and military stretched to the breaking point. Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich had become a nightmare of blood and terror, a hellscape of shattered cities and broken dreams. In the end, the Nazi economic miracle was nothing more than a mirage, a false promise of prosperity and power that led only to death and despair. The Nazis' reckless spending on rearmament and public works projects had left the country with a massive deficit and a crippling debt burden. By 1939, Germany's national debt had risen to over 40 billion Reichsmarks, more than double what it had been in 1933. The titans of industry, the Faustian bargain of Germany's corporate giants in the shadow of the swastika. In the darkened halls of power, where the fate of nations is bought and sold, the titans of German industry gathered to pay homage to their new master. It was a scene that would be repeated time and again in the years to come, as the Nazi regime tightened its grip on the country and the world beyond. For these men, the captains of industry and finance, the rise of Adolf Hitler represented a new dawn, a chance to cast off the shackles of the past and build a future of unimaginable wealth and power. But as they soon discovered, the price of this Faustian bargain would be paid in blood and suffering, as the Nazi war machine consumed everything in its path. At the center of this web of corporate intrigue was IG Farben, a sprawling chemical conglomerate that would become one of the most powerful and infamous companies in the world. Formed in 1925 through the merger of 6 major German chemical firms, including BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst, IG Farben quickly established itself as a dominant force in the global market, with a near monopoly on the production of synthetic dyes, pharmaceuticals, and fertilizers. But it was the company's role in the Nazi war effort that would cement its place in infamy. From the earliest days of the regime, IG Farben threw its weight behind Hitler's vision of a resurgent Germany, providing the raw materials and expertise needed to fuel the country's rearmament program. In 1936, the company signed a lucrative contract with the Nazi government to produce synthetic oil and rubber, key strategic resources that would help to power the German war machine. As the historian Peter Hayes has written, IG Farben's marriage with the Nazi regime was more than a marriage of convenience. It was a fusion of mutual interests and shared values. This fusion was exemplified by the close ties between IG Farben executives and high-ranking Nazi officials, such as Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. But IG Farben's involvement in the Nazi regime went far beyond mere business dealings. The company was deeply implicated in some of the worst crimes of the Holocaust, including the use of slave labor at its factories and the production of Zyklon B, the poison gas used to murder millions of Jews and other victims at the death camps. At the Buna Werke plant in Auschwitz, tens of thousands of concentration camp inmates were forced to work in brutal conditions, producing synthetic rubber for the Nazi war effort. Many of these workers were worked to death or killed by the SS guards who oversaw the plant. As one survivor, Primo Levi, later recalled, Auschwitz was a vast laboratory of death, where the most advanced techniques of mass extermination were tested and perfected. IG Farben's executives, including CEO Karl Krausch and board member Fritz, were well aware of these atrocities, but did nothing to stop them. In fact, they actively participated in the planning and execution of the Nazi slave labor program, seeing it as a way to boost profits and gain favor with the regime. In a meeting with Hitler in 1941, Karl Krausch even boasted that IG Farben's synthetic rubber production would help to win the war. IG Farben was not alone in its complicity with the Nazi regime. Other major German corporations, including Krupp, Siemens, and Daimler-Benz, also played key roles in the country's rearmament program and the exploitation of slave labor. Krupp, the legendary steel and arms manufacturer, was one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the Nazi regime, with its chairman, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, serving as a member of Hitler's inner circle. The company produced a wide range of weapons and equipment for the German military, including tanks, artillery, and naval guns. At its height, Krupp employed over 100,000 workers, many of them slave laborers from occupied countries. As one former Krupp worker later testified at the Nuremberg trials, "We were treated like animals. We were beaten, kicked, and starved. Many of us died from exhaustion or disease." Krupp's wartime profits were staggering, with the company earning over 300 million Reichsmarks in 1943 alone. Gustav Krupp himself was a fervent Nazi and a close friend of Hitler, who once declared, "I am the greatest admirer of your genius, Herr Krupp." Siemens, the electronics and electrical engineering giant, was another major player in the Nazi war machine. The company produced a wide range of products for the German military, including radar systems, communications equipment, and engines for fighter planes. Like IG Farben and Krupp, Siemens also made extensive use of slave labor, with tens of thousands of concentration camp inmates and foreign workers toiling in its factories. In 1944, Siemens even established its own concentration camp, Bobrek, to house Jewish slave laborers who had been selected from Auschwitz. The conditions at Bobrek were appalling, with inmates subjected to brutal beatings, starvation, and disease. As one survivor later recalled, "We were treated worse than animals. The SS guards would beat us with clubs and whips, and many of us died from the terrible conditions." Siemens CEO Karl Friedrich von Siemens was a vocal supporter of the Nazi regime and a member of the Nazi Party. In a speech to Siemens employees in 1933, he declared, "We will do our utmost to prove ourselves worthy of the Führer's trust." Daimler-Benz, the manufacturer of Mercedes-Benz automobiles, was another key player in the Nazi war effort. The company produced a wide range of military vehicles, including trucks, tanks, and aircraft engines. Like its counterparts, Daimler-Benz also relied heavily on slave labor, with over 40,000 concentration camp inmates and foreign workers toiling in its factories. The company's chairman, Wilhelm Kissel, was a vocal supporter of the Nazi regime and a close associate of Hitler himself. In 1944, Kissel even hosted a lavish reception for the Führer at the Daimler-Benz headquarters in Stuttgart, where he presented him with a custom-built Mercedes-Benz limousine as a gift. Kissel was also a member of the Circle of Friends of the Reichsführer SS, a group of industrialists and businessmen who provided financial support to the SS. As the historian Neil Gregor has written, Daimler-Benz's involvement in the Nazi regime was not just a matter of pragmatic adaptation, but of ideological affinity. The complicity of these German corporations in the crimes of the Nazi regime was not limited to the use of slave labor. Many of them also played a direct role in the Holocaust itself. IG Farben, for example, provided the chemicals used to gas millions of Jews and other victims at the death camps, while Krupp and Siemens supplied the ovens and other equipment used in the crematoria. These companies were not simply passive bystanders to the horrors of the Holocaust, but active participants in the machinery of mass murder. As the historian Michael Thad Allen has written, the Holocaust was not just a crime of the Nazi state, but a crime of German society as a whole, including its most powerful and respected institutions. This point was underscored by the testimony of Rudolf Hoss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who stated at the Nuremberg trials, "Without IG Farben, the mass extermination of millions of people would not have been possible." In the aftermath of the war, many of these companies faced a reckoning for their crimes. At the Nuremberg trials, several IG Farben executives were convicted of war crimes and sentenced to prison, while Krupp and Siemens were forced to pay reparations to their former slave laborers. But for many of these companies, the consequences of their actions were relatively minor. IG Farben, for example, was broken up into several smaller firms, but many of its executives went on to hold high-ranking positions in the post-war German chemical industry. Krupp and Siemens, meanwhile, continued to thrive as major players in the global economy, with their wartime crimes largely forgotten or ignored. The rot at the core, greed, graft, and the festering corruption that consumed the Nazi elite. In the shadows of the Third Reich, a cancer was growing, a malignant tumor that fed on the very lifeblood of the Nazi regime. It was a cancer of greed and corruption, of unrestrained avarice and moral decay, and it had infected the highest echelons of the Nazi leadership. From the glittering salons of Berlin to the smoke-filled backrooms of Munich, the party elite indulged in a rampant spree of embezzlement, bribery, and fraud, lining their pockets with ill-gotten gains while the country slid ever closer to ruin. The German people, who had once looked to their leaders with pride and admiration, now saw only a pack of jackals feasting on the corpse of their beloved fatherland. At the center of this web of corruption was none other than Hermann Göring, the corpulent Reichsmarshal and self-styled Iron Knight of the Nazi regime. A man of gargantuan appetites and unbridled ambition, Göring had his pudgy fingers in every pie, from the expropriation of Jewish property to the plunder of occupied Europe. As early as 1934, he had established the Göring Charitable Fund, ostensibly to aid impoverished Germans, but in reality a slush fund for his own lavish lifestyle. By the end of the war, the fund had amassed over 180 million Reichsmarks, much of it from donations extorted from German industrialists and Jewish businessmen. Göring's ostentatious display of wealth was legendary, from his sprawling Karin Hall estate, named after his first wife Karin, to his collection of stolen art, which included masterpieces by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Van Dyck. In 1940, he even commissioned a special train, the Hermann Göring Special, complete with a cinema, a barber shop, and a fully stocked bar. As one of his aides later recalled, Göring loved luxury more than a cat loves milk. But Göring's greed was not limited to personal enrichment. He also used his position to manipulate the German economy for his own benefit, establishing a network of corrupt businessmen and industrialists who paid him huge bribes in exchange for lucrative government contracts. One of the most notorious of these was the Göring-Werke, a massive industrial conglomerate that used slave labor from concentration camps to produce everything from steel to synthetic rubber. As Göring himself once boasted, "I decide who is a Jew." But Göring was hardly alone in his rapacity. Heinrich Himmler, the cold-blooded head of the SS, was another master of the dark arts of financial malfeasance. Through his control of the concentration camp system, Himmler had access to a vast pool of slave labor, which he exploited to the hilt. Companies owned by the SS, such as Deutsche Erd- und Steinwerke, used concentration camp inmates to manufacture everything from bricks to munitions, with the profits flowing directly into Himmler's coffers. Himmler also oversaw the so-called Action Reinhard, the systematic looting of Jewish property in the occupied territories, which netted the SS a staggering 178 million Reichsmarks in cash and valuables. Much of this wealth was funneled into Himmler's personal accounts, including a secret stash of gold and jewels buried near the Bavarian village of Gmund. As one SS officer later testified, Himmler was the richest man in Germany, and he made sure that everyone knew it. But Himmler's corruption went far beyond mere greed. He also used his position to fund a vast network of SS-owned businesses, including publishing houses, porcelain factories, and even a mineral water company. These businesses not only enriched Himmler and his cronies, but also helped to fund the SS's reign of terror across Europe. As Himmler himself once declared, "We have the moral right, we had the duty to our people to do it, to kill this people who wanted to kill us." Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister and self-appointed Gauleiter of Berlin, was another notorious figure in the Nazi kleptocracy. A man of insatiable vanity and ambition, Goebbels used his position to amass a fortune in bribes, kickbacks, and gifts from a variety of sources, including the German film industry, which he ruthlessly controlled. In 1937, he even established his own film production company, the Deutsche Filmherstellungs- und Verwertungs GmbH, which churned out Nazi propaganda films and lined Goebbels' pockets with the profits. Goebbels' extravagant lifestyle, which included a lavish villa on Berlin's Wannsee Lake and a fleet of expensive cars, was the talk of the town. As one contemporary observer noted, "Goebbels lived like a king, and he made sure that everyone knew it." But Goebbels' corruption was not limited to the film industry. He also used his position to extort money from Jewish businessmen, threatening them with arrest and deportation if they did not pay up. In one notorious case, he even forced a Jewish department store owner to sell his business to a Nazi-owned company at a fraction of its value, pocketing the difference himself. As Goebbels once infamously declared, "The Jews are our misfortune." But perhaps the most egregious example of Nazi corruption was the case of Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect, and the man responsible for the regime's grandiose building projects. Speer, who later claimed to have been unaware of the Holocaust, was in fact deeply implicated in the use of slave labor on his construction sites, including the infamous Dora underground factory, where thousands of concentration camp inmates toiled in horrific conditions to produce V-2 rockets. Speer also used his position to enrich himself and his friends, awarding lucrative contracts to his favorite architects and pocketing the kickbacks. In 1943, he even commissioned a special train, the Speer Express, to transport him and his entourage to various construction sites around the Reich. As one of Speer's colleagues later recalled, "Speer was the most corrupt of all the Nazi leaders, and that's saying something." But Speer's corruption went beyond mere greed. He was also a master of propaganda, using his position to create a cult of personality around himself and his grand architectural visions. In one famous episode, he even staged a massive rally in Berlin's Olympic Stadium, complete with searchlights and marching bands, to celebrate the laying of the foundation stone for his new Reich Chancellery. As Speer himself once boasted, "Hitler gave me a great opportunity. By building Nuremberg, I built myself." The corruption of the Nazi elite was not limited to the upper echelons of the party. Throughout the ranks of the SS, the SA, and the various other Nazi organizations, there were countless examples of petty graft, bribery, and embezzlement. SS officers would routinely extort money from Jewish prisoners in exchange for better treatment, while SA men would use their muscle to shake down local businesses for protection money. Even the Hitler Youth was not immune to the rot, with some leaders using their positions to line their own pockets and live the high life. As one former Hitler Youth member later recalled, "We were supposed to be the future of Germany, but some of our leaders were just as corrupt as the rest of them." In one notorious case, a Hitler Youth leader in the town of Gelsenkirchen was caught embezzling funds from the organization's coffers to pay for his gambling debts. When confronted by his superiors, he simply shrugged and said, "Everyone else is doing it, why shouldn't I?" Raiders of the Lost Reich, the hunt for Nazi treasures and hidden hoards in the aftermath of war. In the smoldering ruins of Hitler's shattered empire, a new battle was about to begin. As the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared, the victorious Allies set out on a quest to recover the vast quantities of wealth and treasure that the Nazis had looted from across Europe. It was a task that would take decades, a painstaking process of detective work, diplomacy, and dogged perseverance. But it was also a race against time, as the surviving Nazi elite scrambled to hide their ill-gotten gains and erase the bloody footprints of their crimes. Tracking down these stolen assets would be like searching for needles in a haystack, a task complicated by the fact that many of the perpetrators had gone to ground, taking their secrets with them to the grave. The task was summed up by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who declared in a 1945 speech, "The Nazi war criminals were responsible for the systematic looting of Europe. It is our duty to see that this stolen property is restored to its rightful owners." One of the first places the Allies looked was in the vaults of the Reichsbank, the central bank of Nazi Germany. In the chaos of the war's final days, the bank had been looted by a succession of Nazi officials and German civilians who made off with millions of dollars worth of gold, currency, and other valuables. When American troops finally secured the bank's headquarters in Frankfurt, they found a scene of utter devastation. The vaults had been emptied, the floors strewn with discarded documents and smashed furniture. But even more disturbing was the discovery of a vast hoard of gold teeth, wedding rings, and other personal effects, all stolen from the bodies of murdered Jews and other concentration camp victims. It was a chilling reminder of the depths of Nazi depravity and a powerful motivation for the Allies to press on with their search. The Americans dubbed this grim collection the Reichsbank treasure, and it would become a key piece of evidence in the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals. As the investigation widened, the Allies began to uncover a web of secret bank accounts, dummy corporations, and hidden caches of looted art and treasure. Swiss banks, in particular, came under scrutiny for their role in laundering Nazi gold and providing a safe haven for stolen assets. In 1946, the US Treasury Department issued a gold train report detailing how the Nazis had smuggled looted gold through Switzerland to finance their war machine. The report named several prominent Swiss banks, including Credit Suisse and Swiss Bank Corporation, as key players in this shadowy network. The Swiss government, under pressure from the Allies, eventually agreed to a series of reforms and restitution payments. But the full extent of the country's complicity in Nazi crimes remained a matter of controversy for decades to come. In 1996, Swiss banks finally agreed to a $1.25 billion settlement with Holocaust survivors and their heirs, a belated acknowledgement of their role in the Nazi looting machine. Meanwhile, the hunt for stolen art treasures took on a new urgency as the Allies raced to recover some of the world's most famous paintings and sculptures from the clutches of Nazi collectors. One of the most notorious of these was Hermann Göring, the corpulent Reichsmarshal and avid art enthusiast who had amassed a vast collection of looted masterpieces at his sprawling estate, Carinhall. When US troops finally captured Carinhall in the spring of 1945, they found a treasure trove of stolen art, including works by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Botticelli. Goering, who had fled the estate just days earlier, had left behind a meticulously catalogued record of his collection, which proved invaluable in tracking down the rightful owners of the stolen works. The Americans also discovered Goering's personal diary, in which he gloated over his ill-gotten gains. "It used to be called plundering," he wrote, "but today things have become more humane. In spite of that, I intend to plunder and to do it thoroughly." Another key figure in the Nazi art world was Adolf Hitler himself, who had grand plans to build a massive art museum in his hometown of Linz, Austria. The Führer Museum, as it was to be called, was intended to showcase the finest examples of Germanic art and culture, and Hitler had personally selected many of the works that were to be included. But as the war turned against Germany, the Nazis began to hide away their art treasures in secret caches scattered across the country. In the final months of the war, a special unit of the SS known as the Kunstschutz, art protection, was tasked with transporting these hidden hoards to safety, often using slave labor from concentration camps to do the heavy lifting. When the Allies finally caught up with these secret stashes, they found an astonishing array of masterpieces, from the Ghent altarpiece to the crown jewels of the Holy Roman Empire. In one famous case, a group of American soldiers stumbled upon a cache of looted art in a salt mine in the Austrian town of Altaussee. Among the treasures they found were Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges and Vermeer's The Astronomer, both of which had been stolen from their rightful owners by the Nazis. But perhaps the most famous of all the Nazi loot was the so-called Amber Room, an opulent chamber panelled in precious amber and gold that had once graced the palace of Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg, Russia. Stolen by the Nazis during their invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the Amber Room had been packed up and shipped back to Germany, where it was displayed at Königsberg Castle. But as the Red Army closed in on the city in 1945, the Amber Room disappeared, sparking a mystery that endures to this day. Some believe that it was destroyed in the fighting, while others speculate that it may still be hidden somewhere in the ruins of the castle or in a secret bunker deep beneath the city streets. Despite countless searches and investigations, the fate of the Amber Room remains unknown, a tantalizing reminder of the many treasures that were lost forever in the chaos of war. Despite the best efforts of the Allies, many of the Nazis' stolen treasures remained elusive. Some were spirited away to South America, where they were used to finance the lavish lifestyles of fugitive war criminals like Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann. Others simply disappeared into the murky underworld of the black market, never to be seen again. But the legacy of Nazi looting lived on, as survivors and their descendants fought for restitution and the return of their stolen property. In the 1990s, a series of high-profile lawsuits and international agreements helped to bring some measure of justice to the victims of Nazi crimes, but the scars of the Holocaust remained, a painful reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the long shadow of history. In 1998, 44 nations gathered in Washington, D.C. to sign the Washington Conference Principles on Nazi-confiscated art, a groundbreaking agreement that called for the return of looted artworks to their rightful owners or their heirs. As the hunt for Nazi treasure continues to this day, new discoveries and revelations continue to emerge. In 2012, a trove of more than 1,400 artworks, many of them stolen by the Nazis, was discovered in the Munich apartment of Cornelius Gurlitt, the son of a notorious Nazi art dealer. The hoard, which included works by Picasso, Matisse and Chagall, had been hidden away for decades, a silent testament to the enduring legacy of Nazi crimes. And in 2019, a Dutch museum announced that it had identified more than 170 artworks in its collection that had been looted by the Nazis. a stark reminder that the echoes of the Holocaust still reverberate through the art world and beyond. The discovery of the Gurlitt trove sparked a renewed debate over the fate of Nazi-looted art, with some arguing that the works should be returned to their rightful owners, while others maintained that they should be kept in museums as a reminder of the horrors of the past. As the art historian Lynn Nicholas put it, the story of Nazi art looting is not just a story about art, it's a story about people. It's a story about the lives that were shattered and the families that were torn apart by the Holocaust. As we delve into the murky depths of history, the origins of Nazi wealth reveal a confluence of ambition, exploitation, and stark immorality. In the tumult of the 1930s and 1940s, vast fortunes were amassed through the plunder of occupied territories and the tragic exploitation of countless innocent lives. Reflecting on this past, we consider the words of Margaret Atwood, "War is what happens when language fails." May this exploration of history remind us of the critical need to communicate and understand, serving as a beacon guiding us towards a more just and ethical future. Thank you for joining me in this journey. Farewell, until we uncover more truths in the shadows of history.